Ah, kid, do you hear that? The whispers from the depths of history, quiet but never stopping, telling a story that stretches from the past to the present. These stories belong to great empires shaped by victories and disasters. But among them, there are those whose rise and fall are driven by the will of one man. Today I'm going to tell you about an emperor who changed the fate of Rome. Picture this, a man who inherited Caesar's legacy, sat on Augustus' throne, ruled the most powerful state in the world, yet is remembered in history as a destroyer. Tiberius. He was a warrior and emperor, but also a soul lost in the grip of fear, loneliness, and paranoia. His story is one of how great grandeur decays and disappears. From the brightest days of Rome to a collapse shaken by conspiracies. A reign shaped by the thirst for power and distrust, and the terrifying legacy he left behind. But hold on, we need to take it step by step. First, we'll talk about the world he was born into, how he was raised, and which battles he came back victorious from. Then we'll dive into how he rose to the throne of Rome and ultimately how, like a shadow, he brought this great empire to its knees. If you're ready, let's lift the fog of the past and see, step by step, how Tiberius destroyed Rome. Ah, Rome. The greatest empire the world has ever seen. A power that rose beneath the sun and lasted for centuries. But no empire is eternal. Every great civilization eventually falls. Just like a mountain starts to erode when it reaches its peak. And this is where Tiberius's story truly begins. Now listen closely, kid, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just about dusty history pages. These are stories about how power corrodes the human soul, and how even the greatest emperors can turn into lonely, paranoid shadows of themselves. Tiberius wasn't your average emperor. He was the heir to Augustus, the one who ushered in Rome's golden age. He was a great warrior, a disciplined commander, and skilled in state affairs. But he was also cold, reclusive, and emotionless. He never won the people's love, and he couldn't even trust his own family. His name was associated with fear and suspicion for centuries. Tiberius could have continued Augustus' legacy and taken Rome even further. But in the eyes of the people, he remained less a leader and more a heartless tyrant. He distanced himself from the people, ran away from Rome, and became imprisoned by his own fears. He didn't just kill his enemies, he systematically eliminated his friends as well. With palace conspiracies, betrayals, and fears hidden in the shadows, Tiberius slowly dragged Rome into its downfall. But to see him only as a bad ruler would be a mistake. History isn't just black and white, kid. Tiberius didn't want to be emperor. He didn't ask for the throne. But Augustus' legacy and Rome's destiny pushed him down a road he couldn't turn back from. Power was given to him. And power, well, it's the most dangerous thing that can change a person's soul. Rome was magnificent under Augustus. Roads, cities, laws, arts, everything was in order. But when Augustus died, the system he left behind wavered like fragile glass. And the throne, well, it sat under the heavy feet of a man who was about to break it. Tiberius became one of Rome's first true authoritarian emperors. Augustus, at least in the eyes of the people, acted like a savior of the Republic. The Senate still mattered. But Tiberius, he took power completely into his own hands. He couldn't care less about the Senate. He despised the people, and he became obsessed with paranoia toward the conspiracies around him. And that paranoia started to rot Rome from the inside out. His fear of betrayal made him turn on his friends and advisors. He didn't want to share power, so he ruled the state alone, and over time he lost the people's love entirely. But the real downfall began when he ran away from Rome. When he withdrew to the island of Capri, Rome was left without direction. The power vacuum was filled with conspiracies and massacre. What once was a Rome of order and justice became a place gripped by fear and betrayal. And you need to know this, kid. An empire's fall sometimes comes with a war or a disaster, but Rome's fall started from within. Tiberius's own fears, his isolation, and his mistakes darkened Rome's future. But the story doesn't end here. There's still so much to tell. First, I have to explain the world Tiberius was born into and the events that shaped him. Only then can we truly understand how he became the ruler he did. Are you ready, kid? Then let's take a journey into Tiberius' youth. Kid, a strong ruler doesn't just appear overnight. What shapes him is the world he grows up in. Pain, wars, pressures. These are what either turn someone into a legend or drag them into the dark pages of history. Tiberius is remembered as an emperor, but to understand him, you first need to see him as a child, then as a soldier, because his story begins in the shadow of Rome's greatest emperor and was written in blood on the battlefields. When Tiberius was born in 42 BCE, the Roman Republic was no longer a republic. Civil wars, betrayals, and bloody struggles had dragged Rome into dictatorship. Julius Caesar had been assassinated, but his heir and nephew, Octavian, the man who would later take the name Augustus, became Rome's undisputed leader, and it was into this world that Tiberius was born. But he wasn't just any child. His father, Tiberius Claudius Nero, was a senator with republican views and among Augustus's enemies. His mother, Livia Drusilla, was one of the most influential and intelligent women in Rome, and it was this woman who would change everything. Livia caught Augustus's attention, so much so that she ended her marriage to her husband and became Augustus' wife. This made Tiberius at a young age a part of Augustus' family. But he wasn't born of Augustus's blood. He wasn't destined for the throne. But fate had other plans, and one day he would become the most powerful man in the world. Tiberius' childhood was spent under the strict rules of Augustus. He wasn't spoiled like other children. He was given great responsibilities and taught to be disciplined. From a young age, he was educated in law, rhetoric, history, but most of all, he was trained in the art of war. In Augustus's eyes, Tiberius had one job: to further strengthen Rome's military power. And that's exactly what he did. Before he even reached his 20s, Tiberius began serving in the Roman armies. He was tough, disciplined, and had a strategic mind. Augustus gave him small tasks at first, but over time he realized that Tiberius wasn't just an average commander. He was a leader born in the midst of war, someone who could shape Rome's future. His first major display came in the Pannonian Wars. In the Balkans, tribes were rebelling against Rome. The Pannonians were fierce and stubborn warriors, but Tiberius defeated them with relentless discipline. He moved his army in unexpected ways, surrounded his enemies, and starved them out. In the end, after a bloody battle, Pannonia completely submitted to Rome. But Tiberius' true fame came in the Germanic Wars. Beyond the Rhine River, barbarian tribes were threatening Rome. Rome had attempted campaigns in these regions before, but most had failed. But Tiberius took a different approach to defeat the Germans. Instead of directly engaging them in battle, he turned the tribes against each other. By masterfully using diplomacy and military tactics, he succeeded in dividing his enemies. Eventually, he secured Rome's northern borders and became a true war hero in Augustus' eyes. But all these victories came at a cost. Tiberius grew colder, more distant with each battle. He began to withdraw from people and preferred solitude. While victory cries rang out in Rome, he retreated further into himself, because his destiny would soon place much greater responsibilities on his shoulders. As Augustus grew older, one of the most pressing issues for Rome became who would succeed him. Augustus wanted someone from his own bloodline to be emperor, but he had no direct son, so he first named his grandsons Gaius and Lucius as his heirs. But both died young, and so Augustus was left with only one choice: Tiberius. But don't forget, kid, Tiberius didn't want the throne. He felt at home on the battlefield. The palace intrigues of Rome didn't suit his nature. Augustus, forced the imperial path on him. He even pressured Tiberius more because he knew he was reluctant. He adopted him, handed him all his powers, and taught him how to rule Rome. Tiberius had to continue Augustus' system, but there was always a sense of discomfort within him. For years, he had lived in Augustus' shadow, always under his control. He had never been able to make independent decisions, always caught in someone else's game. That's why, when Augustus died and Tiberius ascended to the throne, his first feeling wasn't victory, it was loneliness. And so one of Rome's most controversial emperors was born. Should he continue Augustus's system or carve his own path? Tiberius faced a difficult decision, and his choices would change the fate of Rome forever. But don't worry, kid, there's much more to tell. Now let's step into his reign as emperor, because that's where the real story begins. Kid, some people are born to claim the throne. They chase power, carefully calculate every step, and dream of one day becoming the ruler. But others? No matter how hard they try to run, they can never escape the grip of fate. Tiberius was exactly that kind of man. He didn't want the throne, but the throne wanted him, and the fate of Rome changed forever. It was the year 14 CE. Rome's greatest leader, the first Emperor Augustus, had passed away in his villa at Nola. The man who had ruled Rome for nearly 50 years was no more. An emperor had died, but the empire lived on. Yet there was a profound silence across Rome. Everyone was asking the same question: what now? Augustus had left a void. The people didn't know who could replace such a leader. The Senate, the army, the provincial governors, everyone was waiting for a new order to be born. And the heir to the throne was clear: Tiberius. But kid, remember, for Tiberius this wasn't a moment of triumph. When the news of Augustus' death reached him, there was no joy or arrogance in his eyes, just a deep silence. He had lived his entire life in Augustus' shadow. Now, he had to carry his legacy. However, Augustus had left not only a legacy, but also a strict will, a document that formalized the succession of Tiberius. And more importantly, the Roman army was ready to support Augustus' chosen heir. What the people, the Senate, or the aristocracy thought no longer mattered. Tiberius had only one path before him: empire. But he didn't choose this path willingly. And this was the first and greatest challenge of his reign. When Tiberius took the throne, he didn't try to become a leader like Augustus, because he wasn't Augustus. He wasn't charismatic, nor did he have the strong bond with the people that Augustus had. Augustus was a father figure to the Romans. Tiberius, on the other hand, was tough, distant, and cold. But he was a soldier, and he governed like one, strict, disciplined, and under rigid rules. He continued the economic and administrative policies that Augustus had implemented for years. He reformed the tax system, strengthened the control of provinces, and brought the army under even stricter discipline. But one of his greatest reforms was reducing public spending. He wasn't fond of Augustus's lavish festivals and large gifts to the people. To Tiberius, Rome's strength should come from disciplined governance, not luxury. This was why he cut many extravagant expenditures, abandoned major construction projects, and focused on protecting the Roman treasury. These reforms strengthened the state's financial structure. But for the people, Tiberius was not as generous as Augustus had been. And over time, this sparked the first embers of growing discontent. Kid, a ruler's greatest test is the relationship with his people and the Senate, and Tiberius began to struggle in this very area. Augustus was a master at managing the Senate. He made them feel powerful, but in reality, he held all the control. Senators thought they had authority by bowing to him, but in truth, Augustus always had the final say. Tiberius, however, was different. He wasn't a game player like Augustus. He established a clear, open relationship with the Senate. You're either with me or you're against me. At first, he tried to follow Augustus' example. He consulted the Senate, sought their opinions, and adhered to the system Augustus had left behind. but many senators couldn't get used to his governing style. Tiberius's cold, detached demeanor in official meetings created an impression of arrogance. Over time, discontent grew among the senators. They were expecting a leader like Augustus, but Tiberius was a completely different kind of ruler. The Senate began to feel powerless in front of him, and this feeling of powerlessness gradually turned into hatred. But Tiberius was aware of something. The Senate was not the real power in Rome. It was merely a shadow of Augustus's reign. And if he truly wanted to control Rome, he couldn't place too much trust in the Senate. This is why in the early years of his reign, he increasingly withdrew. He began to govern with a small circle of advisors. Among them was one name who would become both his greatest supporter and his greatest curse, Sejanus. But kid, the story of Sejanus is long and dark. Don't forget his name just yet. Because the fate of Rome would be shaped by this man. And so Tiberius' rise to the throne began. An emperor unwillingly took control of a throne. Tensions with the Senate grew, the people began to question his stern rule, and most importantly, he was growing increasingly weary of carrying Augustus' legacy. But the real change, the real transformation, hadn't even begun yet, because Tiberius' story wouldn't just be about power struggles. His reign would become a stage for one of Rome's greatest betrayals. And the seeds of that betrayal had already been sown. Kid, history doesn't just remember emperors, but also the ones who walk in their shadows. A counselor standing by a king's side can sometimes be sharper than a sword. And the greatest shadow over Tiberius' throne was cast by a man like this, Sejanus. Was he Tiberius' greatest ally, or a traitor who shook his throne? The answer to this question lies hidden in the darkest years of Rome. Lucius Aelius Sejanus, one of the most insidious and dangerous men in Roman history. Sejanus wasn't from a noble family. His father was a commander in the Praetorian Guard, but his name was never heard in the halls of the Senate. However, Sejanus was different. He wanted to rise to the very top of Rome. He couldn't be an emperor, perhaps, but he could be the mind behind one. And fate offered him that opportunity. Tiberius was crushed by the heavy burden of the throne. He had lived in Augustus' shadow for years, never truly loved by the people, and had fallen into deep conflict with the Senate. At that moment, he was looking for someone loyal to stand by him, an ally, a protector, a right hand. And Sejanus was exactly what he needed. Sejanus first gained Tiberius' trust. He didn't just approach him as a soldier, but as a friend, a counselor. In the complex political atmosphere of Rome, Sejanus positioned himself beside the emperor and offered strategies to eliminate Tiberius's enemies. But Sejanus had only one goal, to seize power, and he took the first step toward it. In Rome, an emperor's life passed under the shadow of swords, and those swords were wielded by the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorians were Rome's elite soldiers. They served as imperial guards, maintaining order both inside and outside the city. But most importantly, they were the closest protectors of the emperor. Sejanus knew this. If he wanted to reach true power, he first had to take control of the Praetorian Guard, and he succeeded. His first move was to centralize the power of the Guard under one roof. Previously, the Praetorian units were stationed across various regions of Rome. Sejanus brought them together and established the Praetorian barracks. Now, these guards were no longer just a protection unit. They had transformed into an army within Rome itself. His second move was to make the guards directly loyal to him. He offered them even more generous rewards than Augustus had, elevated their status, and placed the most loyal ones in key positions. Even Tiberius, unaware, had seen Rome's true power slip into Sejanus's hands. Only one step remained, to remove the emperor from Rome. Kid, great men don't die on the battlefield. They are destroyed in palace corridors amidst whispers. Sejanus devised a plan to eliminate all political rivals in Rome. But first he had to eliminate the greatest obstacle, Tiberius's family. The heir to the empire, Germanicus' son Caligula, and Tiberius' own grandsons were potential claimants to the throne. Sejanus first targeted Germanicus' widow, Agrippina, and her sons. He gradually discredited them, had them accused of treason, and eventually imprisoned them. Agrippina and her sons died in hunger, but that wasn't enough. Sejanus whispered to Tiberius that the Senate, the aristocrats, and the people were plotting against him. He told him that Rome was no longer safe, that the people didn't respect him, and that the Senate was trying to overthrow him. A seed of doubt was planted in Tiberius' mind, and that seed quickly grew into a forest. Finally, Sejanus' greatest move came. He removed Tiberius from Rome. The emperor withdrew to the island of Capri, far from Rome, a leader in seclusion, and thus Sejanus became the sole ruler of Rome. But, kid, power is greedy, and Sejanus was about to make his greatest mistake. But that story belongs to the next chapter. Kid, sometimes the greatest enemy of a ruler isn't the armies, but the doubts that grow in his own mind. A man at the very top of power can't simply trust everyone and lean back comfortably. After all, even his closest friend might be hiding a dagger. Tiberius was once Rome's mighty emperor, but the heavy burden of power brought him not only victories, but also endless paranoia. And thus the emperor who sat on Rome's throne gradually transformed into a man who feared his own shadows. Tiberius's departure from Rome wasn't the flight of an emperor from his country, but rather the escape of a man from the storms within his own soul. But of course, this wasn't just about his own state of mind. There were several reasons for it. The first reason was his endless conflict with the Senate. When Tiberius ascended the throne, he had promised to maintain Augustus' established order, but he lacked Augustus's diplomatic finesse. His relationship with the Senate never improved, and his trust in them steadily eroded. He began to believe that everyone, even his closest advisors, was trying to betray him. The second reason was the fear that Sejanus whispered into Tiberius's ear. Sejanus, with his political machinations, had earned the emperor's trust, and by continuously creating enemies, he pushed him into a state of isolation. Day by day, more names were accused of treason, exiled, or executed. Tiberius started to believe that Rome was no longer a safe place for him. The third reason was perhaps the simplest: fatigue. Tiberius had never truly felt like the real ruler of Rome. He had grown up in Augustus' shadow, never wanting to be heir, yet fate had made him Rome's most powerful man, and perhaps, in the end, he wanted to be rid of this burden. In 26 AD, Tiberius suddenly left Rome. The emperor abandoned his magnificent palace, the powerful Senate, and the crowded forums, retreating to the island of Capri. And Rome was now left in the hands of Sejanus. Ah, Capri! Today this island is known for its deep blue seas and breathtaking beauty, but in those days it was a sanctuary where Rome's former ruler hid from the shadows. After settling on Capri, Tiberius didn't completely withdraw from Rome. He still issued orders as emperor, received messages about state affairs, but he no longer directly managed Rome's affairs, relying on his proxies to wield power. This retreat sparked various rumors in Rome. There were whispers among the people that Tiberius was throwing wild, pleasure-filled parties on Capri, living in decadence with young companions. Sejanus and his supporters stoked these rumors. It was said that the emperor had gone mad, that he would never return to Rome, and that perhaps Sejanus himself might become emperor in his place. In truth, Tiberius had begun to live a life very different from his former days. He spent most of his time in seclusion, living in solitude. But even though he was far from Rome, his eyes remained on the capital. He used his agents to closely monitor Sejanus' movements. And it was at this point that Sejanus would make his greatest mistake. When Tiberius withdrew to Capri, it wasn't difficult to understand who truly ruled Rome. Sejanus had become not just the master of the Praetorian Guard, but of all of Rome. He pressed the Senate into submission. He eliminated his opponents one by one. Using the fact that Tiberius was absent from Rome, he made the emperor's authority a symbolic rather than substantive. But one thing was overlooked. Even though Tiberius had withdrawn from Rome, he was still the emperor, and he was waiting for Sejanus to make a mistake. That mistake was pride. Sejanus began to see himself as the true ruler of Rome. He no longer felt the need to be loyal to Tiberius's orders. He didn't believe the emperor would ever return. Perhaps he was even waiting for Tiberius to die. But Tiberius was smarter than Sejanus had anticipated. Kid, seizing power is one thing, but holding onto it is another, and Sejanus had seized power. But he would fail to hold onto it. But this is the beginning of another story. Kid, power is a great gift, but it is also a perilous one. It is like a knife. When wielded skillfully, it brings victory, but in careless hands, it cuts the wielder. Sejanus, you see, swung that knife over Rome, but in the end, it sank into his own neck. Whispers filled the streets of Rome. Sejanus was no longer just a commander of the guard. He was acting like the master of Rome. While the emperor secluded himself on Capri, Sejanus had bent the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, and the people to his will. But he forgot one thing. True power always rests in the hands of the emperor. Sejanus had spent years earning Tiberius's trust, becoming the emperor's closest confidant. He was seen not just as a commander, but as a right hand, perhaps even an heir. But his greed became his greatest weakness. He believed Tiberius would never return from Capri, that perhaps the emperor had already lost his mind. Some even whispered that Sejanus was preparing to declare himself emperor. But Tiberius, though distant, was fully aware of what was happening. In the quiet rooms of Capri, he received reports from his trusted agents and was watching Sejanus's every move. Thus began one of the greatest tales of betrayal in Roman history. When Tiberius noticed Sejanus's increasing ambition, the fear he inspired, and the rising tensions within Rome, he made a decision. The emperor would erase Sejanus with a sudden and ruthless blow, but doing so directly would mean striking without dismantling Sejanus's network of power. So, Tiberius carefully laid out his plan. In 31 AD, a message bearing Tiberius's signature reached the Senate. It stated that Sejanus had been granted consular authority by the emperor. Sejanus, thinking he had risen to the highest office in Rome, began to celebrate his victory. But he did not read on. In that moment, he had no idea how big a mistake he had made. The day the Senate opened Tiberius's new decree, everything changed. Sejanus's name was now labeled as that of a state enemy. Tiberius declared that Sejanus's treason was proven and that he was to be arrested, demanding his head. Sejanus, struck by this sudden blow, was confused. Just hours earlier, he had been the most powerful man in Rome. Now, he was being dragged from the Senate by the very Praetorian Guard he once commanded. Soldiers who had once answered to him were now chaining him. People gathered in the streets of Rome, rushing to witness the downfall of Sejanus. Just days earlier, they had trembled in fear before him. Now they cursed his name. Power had slipped from his side, and everyone had turned against him. A few days later, Sejanus was sentenced to death and executed in front of the people. But this was just the beginning. After Sejanus's death, Tiberius launched a massive purge in Rome. Sejanus's supporters, allies, and friends were targeted one by one. Senators, guards, merchants, anyone who had supported Sejanus now faced the threat of death. No one knew when or for what reason they would be arrested. People locked their doors and no longer trusted even their closest friends. Screams echoed through the streets at night as one person after another was dragged away or accused of treason. This purge was so vast and merciless that even Sejanus's children were killed. It is said that in one of the most brutal moments of Roman history, Sejanus's young son was ripped from his mother's arms and brutally murdered. Roman law stated that the blood of a traitor could not continue. Thus, Sejanus's name would be remembered for Rome's most terrifying betrayal and the bloodiest fall. Kid, this was one of the darkest days in Roman history. People realized that no one was safe. By Tiberius's orders, Rome had become a city of fear and betrayal. No one could speak loudly in the streets anymore. No one knew who might betray them next. Neighbors began to distrust each other. Senators sought to survive by betraying their closest friends. Tiberius, though still ruling from his retreat on Capri, was no longer seen as a leader by the Roman people, but as a distant tyrannical ruler. When his name was spoken, whispers rose, and people prayed in fear. Sejanus's death solidified Tiberius's throne, but it also turned him into a tyrant. And so Rome's golden age was dragged into darkness by Sejanus's bloody purge. With Sejanus's fall, a new era began in Rome, but what came next? How did Tiberius rule in his final years? What did the people think of him? Kid, these are the subjects of another story, but perhaps it's time to tell them now, don't you think? Kid, a strong empire isn't built on the sword alone. Armies conquer land, but what keeps an empire standing is its economy and the well-being of its people. But under Tiberius, Rome became known not for military victories, but for financial collapse and the suffering of its citizens. Tiberius was a great soldier, a master strategist, but as a statesman, he failed to understand what his people truly needed. His frugality and financial policies slowly ate away at Rome's foundation. The Roman people, who once lived in abundance during Augustus's golden age, were now struggling with hunger, heavy taxes, and misery. In his youth, Tiberius disliked Augustus' extravagant spending. In his eyes, Rome's treasury had to be handled carefully, and unnecessary luxuries needed to be cut. And when he became emperor, he put this belief into practice, drastically reducing state expenses. But here's the problem. Rome was an empire. And in an empire, when the flow of money stops, trade collapses. Tiberius put an end to the grand festivals and generous donations that the people had loved under Augustus. The Roman people were used to their emperors putting on gladiator games, massive feasts, and public handouts. But Tiberius was tight-fisted. He saw most of these events as wasteful spending. This didn't just hurt the people, it crippled Rome's economy. These festivals and spectacles weren't just entertainment, they provided income for thousands of merchants, traders, and workers. Slowly, the streets of Rome grew quieter. The markets weren't as crowded, and trade nearly ground to a halt. As money stopped circulating, small businesses went under, unemployment rose, and unrest spread among the people. On top of cutting government spending, Tiberius also increased taxes. The tax hikes caused major discontent, especially in Rome's provinces. Farmers, merchants, and craftsmen across the empire were forced to pay even more to the Roman treasury. This hit hardest in key economic regions like Asia Minor, Egypt, and Hispania. Farmers had to hand over more grain and goods as taxes. Many went bankrupt, drowning in debt, and lost their lands. Then came the financial crisis of 33 AD, a disaster that shook Rome's economy to its core. That year, large landowners and bankers found themselves unable to pay their debts, triggering a massive economic collapse. The Senate was forced to step in with emergency measures. Finally, Tiberius released 100 million sesterces from the treasury to support the banks. But it was too little, too late. Confidence was shattered, and merchants and bankers started hoarding their wealth instead of reinvesting it. Rome's economy was now a shadow of what it had been during Augustus' reign, and when an empire's economy collapses, one of the first things to suffer is its army. Soldiers' salaries, supply lines, and war expenses all depend on financial stability. Under Tiberius' economic policies, military paychecks started arriving late. This was especially frustrating for the legions stationed in the empire's border regions. Rumors of mutiny began to spread. Soldiers who had enjoyed their golden years under Augustus were now feeling the strain of Tiberius's cost-cutting measures. Meanwhile, unrest was growing within Rome itself. Poverty and unemployment were rising, and more people were left starving in the streets. While Tiberius secluded himself on the island of Capri, the people of Rome had all but forgotten their emperor. Instead, they were looking for a leader who would actually listen to them and understand their struggles. And this growing frustration would soon pave the way for the rise of Gaius Caligula Kid. Rome was once a gleaming empire of gold and prosperity. Augustus was a leader loved by the people, but under Tiberius, the empire began to rot from within. His frugality and harsh financial policies led to suffering among the people, discontent in the military, and the beginning of economic downfall. But this wasn't even Rome's worst era, because those who came after Tiberius would push the empire into an even greater catastrophe. So what happened next? How did Caligula inherit Tiberius' legacy? How much further did Rome descend into chaos? Well, kid, that's a story for another time. Or maybe it's time to tell it. What do you think? Ah, kid, history is full of great rulers, powerful leaders, but some of them chose to rule with fear rather than wisdom. And Tiberius, his story is one of those. He could have been one of Rome's greatest emperors, but under his rule, the Senate fell silent, friendships turned into suspicion, and fear took over the streets of Rome. Tiberius wasn't a ruler who led his people. He was a man trapped by his own paranoia, surrounded by untrustworthy advisors and dangerous intrigues. And that paranoia cast its shadow over even Rome's most powerful institution, the Senate. Kid, take a look at Rome's past. The Senate used to be the heart of the Republic, the place where Rome's most powerful men gathered to debate laws and make great decisions. But Tiberius never truly trusted it. At first, he acted like he was working alongside the Senate, but in reality, he saw them as nothing more than puppets. In the early years of his reign, he tried to maintain the system Augustus had built, but many in the Senate saw his rule as cold, detached, and authoritarian. Tiberius was the kind of emperor who believed that only a select few should be in power. He didn't care about the will of the people, nor did he want the Senate to represent them. In his eyes, ruling Rome was an emperor's job, and his alone. And because of that, the last remnants of the old republic started to fade away. Kid, a ruler's greatest enemy isn't his people, it's his own fears. And Tiberius, he never trusted the Senate or the nobility. He believed they had been loyal to Augustus, but never to him. And so, a new era of fear and betrayal began in Rome. Under Tiberius' rule, a system of informants became stronger than ever. Anyone could be accused, and even the smallest suspicion could lead to death. Senators, generals, merchants, even ordinary citizens, everyone started living in fear. One of the most terrifying tools at his disposal was the Maiestas law, essentially a law against treason. Originally, it was meant to punish only major conspiracies or rebellions, but under Tiberius, it became a weapon. Now, simply saying something bad about the emperor could be considered treason. Rumors tore friendships apart. Even lifelong allies betrayed each other, because those who reported others were rewarded. And then came Sejanus, the man who made things even worse. As Tiberius's right-hand man, Sejanus took control of the Praetorian Guard, turning them into an army of spies, lurking in every corner of Rome. Rome was no longer a city of trust, debate, and open discussions. Now, everyone was being watched. Kid, maybe Tiberius' greatest legacy was the final nail in the coffin of the Roman Republic. Yes, Augustus had already weakened the Republic when he declared himself princeps, the first citizen. But at least Augustus still respected the Senate to some degree. He kept it around as a balancing force. But Tiberius, he stripped the Senate of any real power. He wanted to make it clear to everyone he was the true ruler of Rome. The senators, who once carried the weight of the Republic on their shoulders, had become nothing more than fearful yes men, waiting for orders, afraid to speak out. The Senate was no longer the governing force of Rome. It had become a mere shadow of its former self. existing only to approve the emperor's decisions. And with that, the last traces of the Republic disappeared under Tiberius's paranoia and iron grip. Rome no longer belonged to the Senate, it belonged to the emperor alone. Kid, a ruler can govern through fear and oppression, but history has shown us that kind of rule never lasts forever. Tiberius may have been the most powerful man in Rome, but Rome was never meant to be ruled by fear. The legacy he left behind? Blood, betrayal, and decay. But someone was coming, a man who would change Rome's fate once again. His name? Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, or as you might know him, Caligula. So, what happened next? What kind of chaos followed Tiberius's death? Kid, that is a story for another time. Kid, history. Sometimes it's a mirror of the truth, and sometimes it's a fairy tale written by the victors. How much can the truth be twisted or changed? Well, Tiberius's story is just like that. Some historians paint him as a tyrant who ruled Rome with fear, made his people suffer, and got caught up in immoral deeds. Others say he was an underrated leader who never got the credit he deserved, especially his years spent on Capri Island. Oh, kid, if only you heard the stories about those years. Men falling over like barrels of wine, halls where lust ruled, and wild feasts where the old emperor supposedly satisfied his darkest desires. Was it really like that, or were these just stories made up by the new regime to smear the past? Kid, when Tiberius left Rome and withdrew to Capri, it sparked a lot of rumors among the people of Rome. To the public, Tiberius leaving for Capri seemed like him running away from Rome. And when a ruler abandons his throne and retreats into seclusion, the people start talking about him non-stop. Over time, rumors about his life on Capri grew into something awful. They said Tiberius was addicted to perverse desires, bringing young men and women to his palace by force, throwing horrific parties. It was said he enjoyed cruel games that terrified his servants. In Capri, people talked about the terrible excesses that Suetonius called the Tiberiana Deliciae. Supposedly, Tiberius used young boys for his pleasures and threw the old and weak off cliffs. So, kid, how does that sound to you? Truth, or just a made-up tale from an enemy? Most of what we know about Tiberius comes from the works of historians like Tacitus and Suetonius. But these guys had their own biases. Tacitus was a strong opponent of imperial rule. To him, the fall of Rome began with the imperial system. And Tiberius was the one who sped up that downfall. Suetonius, on the other hand, loved sensational stories. His accounts were more about the kind of stories the public wanted to hear than actual facts. In both of their stories, they focus only on Tiberius's bad side. They don't mention he was a good general, or that he kept order after Augustus, or that he managed Rome's treasury well. Because, kid, people love a story about a crazy tyrant. But we don't have any first-hand accounts, no documents written by Tiberius himself, no defense from him. Everything we know comes from his enemies' accounts. Kid, when a powerful man dies, his enemies target the only thing left to destroy: his name. Tiberius was the second emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which ruled Rome for centuries. Smearing him made the emperors who followed him look stronger and more justified. But don't forget, history is always written by the victors. And if a ruler can still hold on to power, even if he's not loved by the people, maybe he's not as weak as they say. So kid, do you think Tiberius was really an immoral tyrant? Or was his name intentionally tarnished as Rome's system changed? Even history can't answer that question for sure. Kid, it's hard to imagine the final moments of a powerful ruler, the man who once ruled over all of Rome, dying alone on his deathbed. History can be so cruel, even to the mightiest. Tiberius' last years were like those of an old lion retreating into seclusion. no longer as powerful, as fierce, but still as lonely as ever. He pulled away from Rome, shaken by Sejanus's betrayal, and grew suspicious of everyone he once trusted. But like all men, his end came. Was it a quiet one, or was he murdered? Well, let's dig into that. Tiberius died in March of 37 AD in Misenum, Campania. He was old, 77 years old, which was a pretty long life for a Roman emperor. But the story of his death is full of mystery. Some sources say he died of natural causes, old age, sickness, maybe just the passing of a tired soul from its body. But others claim he was killed, and at the center of this claim is the man who would become Rome's next emperor, Caligula. Yet, according to the stories, when Tiberius was close to death, the people around him thought he had passed away and began making preparations to announce it. But just as they were about to, Tiberius opened his eyes. At that moment, Macro Caligula's biggest supporter and the head of the Praetorian Guard took control. He covered Tiberius with a blanket, suffocated him, and smothered him to death. Is this just a rumor, or could it be true? We'll never know for sure. But one thing's for certain. When Tiberius died, there were many in Rome who celebrated. The people, who had hated this old emperor for years, rejoiced in the streets at his passing. With Tiberius' death, a new name took the Roman throne, Caligula. The people greeted Caligula's rise to power with great excitement. He was young, and unlike Tiberius, he had won the love of the people. But unfortunately, the Roman people quickly realized they had made a mistake. Tiberius's tough but orderly rule was over. In its place came a period filled with unbelievable madness. After Tiberius's relatively stable reign, Caligula's tyranny, instability, and bloody rule would shake Rome to its core once more. That's why some historians view Tiberius differently. They don't see him as a tyrant who led Rome to disaster, but rather as a ruler who couldn't stop a madman like Caligula from taking the throne. Now, kid, you should ask yourself this: what did Tiberius really leave behind for Rome? Some say he ruled with fear and betrayal, holding the empire together with cruelty. But others say he filled Rome's treasury, maintained the system Augustus left behind, and kept things stable. The truth is, Tiberius was a warrior emperor. He defended the borders, continued Augustus' legacy, and preserved Rome's power. But he was never loved like Augustus was. Maybe he lived in Augustus' shadow and never won the people's love, but still tried to keep the empire standing. But in the people's memory, he remains a cruel, reclusive figure associated with immoral rumors. And sadly, history doesn't always write the truth. It often writes the story people want to hear. Son, history can be cruel. Sometimes it elevates a ruler, and other times it makes them a scapegoat. Tiberius was one such ruler. Some describe him as a tyrant who led Rome to ruin, while others see him as a misunderstood man simply trying to preserve Augustus's legacy. But we must open the dusty pages of history carefully and search for the truth. So let's ask, was Tiberius really the man who destroyed Rome? Or was the decline that began under his rule simply unavoidable? Tiberius's reign marked a turning point in Rome's history. First, the connection between the emperor and the people weakened. Augustus, who portrayed himself as a part of the people, had won their love by keeping the memory of the republic alive. But Tiberius withdrew from the people. To him, the people were ignorant, the Senate was unreliable, and friends would eventually betray him. So, he ruled Rome with fear. The system of informants paralyzed the Senate. Senators spent more time trying to survive than actually doing their jobs. The Praetorian Guard, once just the emperor's soldiers, had become a power that shaped Roman politics. The rise and fall of Sejanus completely shifted the balance of power in Rome. And perhaps most importantly, Rome no longer had an emperor in the eyes of the people, but a dictator. This is why historians criticize Tiberius. His fear-based rule set the stage for future emperors to follow the same path. Son, when Tiberius died, Rome was still a superpower, but it had begun to rot from the inside. The authoritarian rule that started under him became a model for the emperors who came after. Caligula took the fear-based system left by Tiberius even further. He went mad, ruling the empire with blood and madness. Then came Claudius, who completely forgot the republican traditions and centered power in the army. And later, one of the most controversial figures in Roman history, Nero. They say Nero set Rome on fire and killed his own people, but this corruption didn't start overnight. That's why some historians say Tiberius wasn't the man who destroyed Rome, but he laid the foundation for the system that led to its downfall. What's written about Tiberius is generally negative. Historians like Tacitus and Suetonius portray him as a cruel, paranoid, and immoral man. But remember this, son, history is written by the victors. Tacitus and Suetonius were close to the Senate, and Tiberius never trusted the Senate. So, how impartial are the things they wrote about him? Some modern historians argue that Tiberius was actually a brilliant administrator, but because of his poor public relations, he became one of the most hated emperors. The truth is, he was neither a great hero nor an absolute villain. He was a man who sat on the Roman throne but never truly belonged there. And so, son, Tiberius' story ends here. He never became a people's hero like Augustus, nor a legend like Julius Caesar. His name is remembered more for betrayal, fear, isolation, and dark rumors. But still, under his reign, Rome stood strong. Wars were won, the treasury filled, and the empire continued to grow. So let's ask, is a ruler's success measured by how the people remember him, or by whether he was able to keep his empire standing? History will continue to answer this question. Now go, son, and keep this story in your mind, because history not only tells us what has happened, but also what is yet to come.